The evolution of living things. Section 3. Natural selection in action. Key concept. Natural selection explains how populations become adapted to changes in their environment and why some species become extinct.
As you read this section, keep in mind what you will learn. Genetic variation and environmental factors affect evolution by natural selection. Separation, adaptation, and reproductive isolation can produce new species. Extinction occurs when the adaptations of a species are insufficient for survival in a changing environment. Why it matters. Natural selection accounts for the great diversity of living things. In this section, you will learn the following new vocabulary: speciation, extinct.
A unique insect species lives on a particular island. A storm carries a few members of a bird species to the island. Will the birds survive in their new environment? Will the insect species survive if the birds prey on the insects? Many factors determine if a population will survive in its environment or become extinct. Over time, a population may evolve new adaptations which enable it to survive in its environment. The theory of evolution by natural selection explains how a population can change in response to its environment. Changes in populations. For natural selection to occur, a population must have genetic variation and thus a variety of traits. Environmental factors determine which traits in a population are favorable and which are unfavorable. Genetic variation. Genetic differences are responsible for the differences between species and between members of the same population. The genetic variation of a population is a measure of how much individuals in a population differ genetically. In a population that has high genetic variation, members have different alleles or forms of their genes. As a result, the population will have a large variety of traits. The individuals in a population that has low genetic variation have many of the same alleles. Therefore, the population has a small variety of traits. Genetic variation is important for the survival of a species. For example, populations of cheetahs, as shown in Figure 1, and other endangered species have a low genetic variation. Populations with a low genetic variation are less likely than populations that have a high genetic variation to adapt to changes in their environment. For example, if some members of a population cannot naturally resist a disease, the species is less likely to survive a major outbreak. Environmental factors. Individuals in a population often have different traits. But which traits are favorable and which traits are unfavorable? The answer depends on environmental factors. Environmental factors are the conditions in an environment that affect the organisms that live there. Different environments have different environmental factors. For example, organisms that live in a desert need to be able to survive in an area that receives little water. And organisms that live near coral reefs need to be able to survive in salt water. Also, organisms living near a coral reef have different food sources and different predators than organisms in deserts do. Certain traits are better in certain environments. For example, a snake that lives in tall green grass may benefit from being green. In this environment, a green snake will be able to hide from predators more easily than a brown snake will. Therefore, green snakes will survive and reproduce more than brown snakes will. But being brown may be more beneficial if the snake lives on a forest floor that has a large amount of dead leaves. On a forest floor, a brown snake will probably survive and reproduce more than a green snake will. Forming a new species. Sometimes drastic changes that can form a new species take place. A new species may form after a group becomes separated from the original population. This group forms a new population. Over time, the new population becomes adapted to its new environment. Over time, both populations evolve different adaptations. The two populations differ so greatly that they can no longer mate successfully. The new population may then be considered a new species. The formation of a new species as a result of evolution is called speciation. Figure 2 shows two species of squirrels that live on opposite sides of the Grand Canyon. At one time, these squirrels were probably part of one population. As the Grand Canyon became larger, the population became separated and evolved into two species. Separation. Speciation often begins when a part of a population becomes separated from the rest. The process of separation can happen in many ways. For example, a newly formed canyon, mountain range, or lake can divide a population, as Figure 3 shows. Movements of Earth's continental and oceanic plates can also affect the distribution of organisms. Adaptation. After two groups have separated, natural selection continues to act on the groups. Over many generations, the groups may evolve different sets of traits. If the environmental conditions for each group differ, the group's adaptations will differ. For example, a population of birds may become separated into two groups living on two different islands. The birds living on the island that has bigger, tougher seeds will probably evolve different adaptations for eating than the birds living on the island that has small, soft seeds will. Reproductive isolation. Natural selection can cause two separated groups to become very different. If the groups are reunited and cannot interbreed anymore, the groups have undergone reproductive isolation. If they cannot interbreed, the two groups are no longer the same species. Figure 4 shows how species of Galápagos finches may have evolved through separation, adaptation, and reproductive isolation. Extinction. Organisms have adaptive characteristics that help them survive in their environment. But what happens when the environmental factors change? Sometimes organisms can survive and reproduce after the environment has changed. However, if the adaptations of a species are not sufficient for organisms to survive, the species may become extinct. A species is extinct when all individuals of the species have died. Increased competition, new predators, and the loss of habitat are examples of environmental conditions that can lead to extinction. Increased competition. Resources such as food, water, shelter, space, or sunlight are in limited supply in the environment. Populations of different species often compete for resources. When the quantity of resources in an environment decreases, competition for the remaining resources increases. If the members of a species cannot gather the resources that they need, the species may become extinct. New predators. Sometimes a new species enters an area. The new species may come from a nearby area or may be introduced by humans. For example, the European red fox, shown in Figure 5, was introduced to Australia by humans. Species in Australia, such as the numbat in Figure 5, do not have adaptations to escape foxes. So, foxes prey on numbats and have caused the population of numbats to decrease. Many species in Australia are endangered because of the introduction of new predators. Loss of habitat. Most species get the food, water, and shelter that they need from the habitat in which they live. What happens if a habitat is destroyed? Pollution can damage a habitat so that organisms can no longer live there. Habitats can also be destroyed by natural disasters, such as floods, storms, and forest fires. When a population loses its habitat, it may move to a new area. Sometimes, the population may not have adaptations that allow it to live in nearby environments. As a result, species may go extinct.